Hello, Prestige heads, and welcome to American Prestige. I'm Danny Bessner here all alone because Derek has been around war maxing and he needs a little bit of a break. But I am very happy to welcome to the podcast my old friend, your favorite professor, Sam Moyn. Sam is the Kent Professor of Law and History at Yale University. And I've invited Sam to talk about Jürgen Habermas, one of the major intellectuals, one of the major philosophers of the 20th and even into the 21st centuries who recently passed away. So, Sam, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks very much. Habermas maxing episode.
Yeah, we're Habermas Max. I'm just going to start talking like a Gen Zer. I think I'll be able to fit in. So the first thing that I think we should know about Habermas, and my Dr. Bruter, Matthew Spector, wrote an intellectual biography of him, which is his life background. Habermas is one of the all-time tweets, something along the lines as "I was a Hitler Youth sad face," which will go down in history along with the theory of communicative action as a method of communication. But who was Habermas? Where did he come from? And could you please situate him in German history, and particularly in the history of the Federal Republic?
Well, so he's born in the Nazi years in what's going to become West Germany. He's born in 1929, so he's 3.5 years old when Adolf Hitler takes power. He is old enough that it's possible for him to join the Hitler Youth. Never in the Nazi Party. I think he is kind of sent to man anti-aircraft, at the tail end of World War II. So what maybe distinguishes him is not so much that he lived through World War II, because that was true of so many, of the West Germans who made it out, but that he decided in his, youth, after he did his doctorate, to kind of come out as a critic of his elders for essentially, suppressing what had happened, not discussing it, allowing a lot of continuities. And this came kind of the first big sign of this is when he writes a big journalistic article, which he did from a very young age, about Martin Heidegger, who had republished one of his books that referred to the inner truth and greatness of Nazism. And Habermas called him out, ruffled a lot of feathers, big debate. And he then became a kind of acolyte of the Frankfurt School, the leaders of whom Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, returned to West Germany after World War II. And the rest is kind of history. He lives his philosophical career kind of in thinking about the Nazi era and what it will mean to, transit away from it in West Germany, later Germany, and in reckoning with the philosophical legacy of the Frankfurt School.
So he's often referred to, correct me if I'm wrong, as the major thinker of the second generation of the Frankfurt School of Social Research, the Institute of Social Research, the Frankfurt School. Could you give, I know this is a tough one, but could you talk, what is critical theory for that first generation? And then how does Habermas, in 40 seconds or less, how does Habermas build upon that critical theory in the new context of the Federal Republic? I mean, I guess the first thing to start with is the so-called crisis of Marxism of the 1920s and where the critical theorists take it from there.
Yeah, so I mean, the critical theorists, are Marxists, but they are impressed by the failure of the working class to revolt in the West, and they're going to end up defined as Western Marxists as opposed to Eastern Marxists, and so they're not just diagnosing the failure of revolution in the West; they're also looking out and seeing that communism in the Soviet Union is not what they want. And so they're caught between what becomes fascism in the West and communism in the East. And they emigrate to the United States and develop so-called critical theory. And, very complicated. But Habermas, after World War II, is immensely impressed by the founders but he also thinks they have sold the Enlightenment short. And he's really from the first a kind of defender of the Enlightenment. His second book, because in Germany you have to write a second dissertation in order to get a job, and his is called The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere. And it's basically like a modest criticism of the Frankfurt School, especially the kind of Adorno-Horkheimer thesis in their wartime book, Dialectic of Enlightenment. So in the first half of Habermas's structural transformation, he says the Enlightenment was an emancipatory uh, movement based on communication. It arose out of kind of coffee house chatter. Maybe, I don't know if Habermas ever saw Twitter, must have known about
Well,
it.
Sam,
Uh,
could I actually put in a two finger here? Do you know who Habermas cites on that insight? A little man
no,
named
tell me.
Hans Speyer. It was Speyer
Okay,
who
there you
developed
go.
the
I know
sociological
you've
idea
heard
of
of
the
him.
importance. Yeah, yeah, I've heard of him. Speyer developed the idea about the coffee house in one of his early sociological writings, and Habermas actually cites him
Right.
on the first or second page, if I'm remembering correctly, of this notion of the
Amazing.
coffee house as contributing to public opinion. So I think this is sort of
Amazing.
the development of public opinion. So this is something that is emergent from this 30s context. Sorry to interrupt. Just no one knows that, and
No, no,
I happen to know that. Yeah,
I did not know that, and that's terrific, and it makes your first book so important as part of the
couldn't
source
agree
code
more.
for
Flattery
second
will get you everywhere.
generation critical theory. So at any rate, the structural transformation defends the Enlightenment and the kind of potential of communication that comes out of it, basically like a culture of critical discourse that is going to serve emancipation. Troublingly, he says in the late 19th century, the spirit of enlightenment is eclipsed by a new form of capitalism that makes it impossible. So he joins the Adorno Horkheimer story, but he is much more favorable to let's say the origins and potential of the Enlightenment before it loses steam and is co-opted by capitalism.
So what does Habermas do with that? Because he's growing up in an environment, sort of the Wirtschaftswunder, economic boom of post-war West Germany. Capitalism seems to be doing quite well. Not only that, capitalism seems
Yeah.
to be providing for the working classes. And so I think this is a problem that is confronting left-wing intellectuals in the 1950s, is that the predictive notion of that capitalism will lead to more immiseration is not proving quite as true as Marx would have supposed. So, how does he deal with that economic reality? And how does he deal with the political reality of post Nazi Germany? How does his work fit into that?
Well, so as you observe, the first generation of the Frankfurt School is already kind of grappling with the failure of 19th century Marxism to keep its predictive promises. And that becomes especially glaring in the context of the economic miracle, where it seems as if the working class is, if not, satisfied, then satisfied enough to aspire to the kind of regnant bourgeois conformity. And yet, the Frankfurt School's theory of kind of mass culture as manipulation, um, it was developed precisely to explain how, in these circumstances of being bought off, the working class is also living a life of, illusion, basically. And so I think Habermas has much less trouble with that. I think where he differs with the Frankfurt School from the first is in his rejection of their hopelessness. Horkheimer becomes quite conservative in the 50s in the Federal Republic towards the end of his life. And Adorno basically says, I'm not counseling resignation, but this is not the time for redemption. The best we can do is preserve a utopianism through a cult of modernist art and send messages in a bottle to the unknown future when um, progress may be possible and for someone else. Habermas is not satisfied with that. And so he's a bitter critic of the compromises of West Germany, especially what he regards as its insufficient break from Nazism. Now, the Frankfurt School kind of had already said that, America, West Germany, these were, much more complicit with fascism, maybe themselves fascist in their own social order. And what Habermas wants to do is see if there's a potential in affiliating with the West in the Cold War for West Germany to maybe activate a kind of enlightenment and progress that Adorno and Horkheimer see as kind of irretrievable in their own situation. So that's really where he, is set up for the 1960s, when he's going to inherit the Frankfurt School, but he's also going to be facing down, students in revolt, and that gives him some optimism about reactivating the Frankfurt School's critical project, but also, you know, he's fundamentally an intellectual who's going to want to build a new account of social theory. At one point, at this point, he still thinks of himself as potentially reconstructing Marxism, certainly inheriting the Hegelianism of the Frankfurt School and a kind of left Hegelian or Marxist account of how collective learning and progress are going to be possible in the modern world.
So, just a couple of questions, because I'm not a specialist, but my understanding is that also Habermas takes a sociological turn, whereas the Frankfurt School's critical theory, particularly in the 30s and the 40s, is most unique for combining psychoanalysis and economic and sociological thinking. And there are different members of the Institute: Erich Fromm, more of a psychoanalyst; Horkheimer, more of a philosopher; Friedrich Pollock, in particular, more of an economist; Franz Neumann, Otto Kirchheimer, more
Right.
sociologist. And Habermas really pushes it in more of a sociological direction. He's very historically informed. He's doing all the historical reading, and so I just wanted to ask you: is that correct? He puts it in more of a less of a philosophical and more on a material. Even though he's a philosopher, he really emphasizes the sort of structural transformation of the public sphere in a sociological sense and less of a psychoanalytical sense.
I think that's true, that he is not as interested in psychoanalysis as the folks in the first generation. He's interested in everything, though, and that includes psychology. I'd say, we have to remember he died as an extremely old man, so his career had many phases. The first book is really it is social theory, but it's light touch. He's not kind of trying to really yet follow in the footsteps of people like Emil Durkheim, Max Weber. In the 1970s, he's kind of interested in theorizing knowledge. He has a book about called Knowledge and Human Interests, and it's going to be about what are the ways of thinking about epistemology from the perspective of a critical, even Marxist philosophy, so that we can take seriously what philosophers say about how we know, but also think there might be an emancipatory perspective on epistemology. And then he begins his really masterwork, which is involves leaving his job and setting up in this place
Let,
called Darmstadt. Good.
Yeah, let's get to that in a second, because I do think it's
All right.
important to mention his response to 68, because this is famously Adorno was a guest at it. This is when all the veterans
Yes.
of Weimar start really deploying the Weimar analogy. They see the students as literally being analogous to the Nazis and communists of the
Yes.
20s. They use this phrase all
Yes.
the time. But Habermas has somewhat different reaction. And this is, I think, the breaking moment when you see the first generation give way to the second. So, what was Habermas's role or response to the 68 student revolts in Europe, in particular in France and Germany?
Well, he's more conciliatory. He's a young assistant, and he's kind of part of the generation that, in a sense, discovers that their elders were radicals. I mean, there's talk of going down the basement in the Institute for Social Research, which is the formal name of the Frankfurt School's kind of institution, and finding the old issues of this interwar journal, which was quite Marxist, quite radical, and Habermas is not like by any means a kind of leftist radical. He's always very professorial. His main goal is to talk to other people. That includes students. Students, famously basically kill Adorno by kind of shaming him one day in class. A woman bared her breasts in the classroom, and he dies not long after, drops dead of a heart attack. Habermas is conciliatory, but he also warned students not to be left fascist in the kind of famous or notorious allegation. So he wants, in his devotion to the Enlightenment, at least self-styled, to kind of always keep the focus on rational discussion. What are your protests? He is more conciliatory because he thinks protests of the bourgeois order of the 50s and 1960s are well founded. Critique of the generation of the fathers who have served Nazism and then forgotten about it as if no reckoning is necessary is also quite important to him.
So you were talking about the book that I think is his masterwork, would you say, The Theory of Communicative Action, 2 volumes. How does he arrive at that book? And then for people who are not specialists in philosophy or Habermas, what is the ultimate take of that book? It's so funny in 2020s to refer to these like huge philosophical
Sure.
treatises. What's Habermas's take on rationality? But
Yeah.
what is his theory of communication, and then in what ways did it become influential? And then I do want to get to your criticism of Habermas, or what you think that he missed or
Sure.
got wrong, and all that stuff.
Well, so just to go back, this is the book that's his, attempt to join that tradition of social theory, and he was haunted or dogged by a kind of reputation for eclecticism. There's kind of every discipline in it. He reads educational theory. He's very indebted to psychology. It just not psychoanalysis. So he's very influenced by someone like Lawrence Kohlberg, who has a theory of the stages of our maturation. Um, and then he does want to have a story of modernity, but fundamentally, Habermas's goal is to think about refounding emancipation on the belief that it's going to merge through communicative interaction. And he develops a whole story that, society is about, staging different forms of interaction over time. It's a theory of action, but action is speech, very influenced by Hannah Arendt in that regard. And um, the idea is that there would be like a telos to the communicative process and a society that makes it possible, which would be undistorted communication, in which there's no more power, or rather, the only power is going to be the what he calls the unforced force of the better argument. And so, you know, precisely as post structuralism, which is about the lability of language, about the relation of language and power, is like conquering the West. Habermas has an almost, I don't know when I call it naive, but touching belief that we should think of communication as argumentative, and of argumentative interaction as actually leading us to more and more kind of collectively constructed agreement and truth. And so he thinks of this as all we have in the absence of religion. If there's no more metaphysical reality, the only social reality is one we all collectively, as free and equal um, subjects, kind of construct together. And it's a very impressive book. It's very much an attempt to remain true to Marxism in a certain sense, to reconstruct it as a theory of communication, but recognizing that this project of emancipation is haunted by domination, especially in kind of economic terms. That's what much of the second volume of that book's about. And
It's
then there's a
interesting.
break in his career.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. It is interesting. I want to just ask 2 questions. It is interesting. There's almost a turn to communication among the left. I mean, the other famous book is
Mhm.
Manufacturing Consent, which is
Yes.
late 80s. I mean, it's a few years later. But
Yes.
there's this, like, as neoliberalism emerges and replaces sort of mid-century Fordism, there's this turn in communication. Why do you think
Yeah.
that is? Because from our perspective, like you said naive, right? It seems naive from the perspective of the 2020s, as the sort of world is being deregulated and financialized. You have a lot of left-wing thinkers really focusing on ideal situations of communication on one hand, or communication critique on the hand of Chomsky. What do you think is going on there?
I think it's before it's a response to neoliberalism or anything like that, which he really didn't respond. It's more a kind of his entry in the world in which people read and discussed Marshall McLuhan. Like, what does it mean that we live in a radically different informational environment? I mean, we think we're original when we, say that, but it's really in the 50s and especially 60s that people began to recognize that we do not, get at the way the world is except through the intermediation of not just news but images, motion pictures, television, and that was a source in structural transformation, as for the Frankfurt School, of a lot of kind of bitter dejection, because what else is that except the imprisonment of you know of folks. Any hope for freedom is unavailable. And so what Habermas does in his mid-career is try to coax enlightenment optimism from the very fact that we are communicative beings interacting with each other. There's no truth outside that process of building it together. So then the question would be, how do we theorize and maybe imagine a world in which communication is the only source of emancipation we have?
So there's a big break in his career, and what do you think people should understand about the second half of his career? Because I'm a layperson. It does seem that this is his apex, and then there's a bunch of other work, but none of which has had nearly the influence. But I am also not a philosopher or specialist in Habermas. So am I wrong, or what should people know about this second half of his career?
Well, I'd say it's funny because if you tell the story of his reception, it's Habermas's, first book, really second dissertation called Structural Transformation, that probably has been most widely read. However, it's only translated to English in, I think, 1989. And so when I went to graduate school in 1994, it was literally the foundational text for my first graduate seminar. And we had a whole, seminar on the public sphere and intellectuals in the public sphere and so forth and so on. And um, I think far more than other books, that one had, ironically, the not just the longest influence, but the most influence. If people read other books, I doubt it was Theory of Communicative Action. The same time period, Habermas gives some famous lectures called The Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, which I think would probably be the second most influential of his books. And it's really a story about how modern philosophy has been imprisoned by a mistake, not seeing the interactive source of truth. And so he goes through the philosophical tradition. It's actually quite fascinating, to see him go through, Hegel to Derrida, and show how each of them approaches the insight into, the communicative um, importance of language, but doesn't kind of see the emancipatory story that Habermas wants to, locate in language. But if something big does happen, because basically what I think happens is the ink's drying on Theory of Communicative Action in the late 80s. The Soviet Union ends. Germany reunites. He's actually opposed to that, or at least the speed with which it happens. But there's a new world, a new unipolar world, a new neoliberal world. We can say it was already in the making in starting in the 1970s, but the 1990s is the great age of mistakes, I think, and almost I think to me today Habermas is someone who's so I think it's his case is so touching because his potential for taking another path was, I think, extremely. I think it was there for him, but he falls prey to the American unipolarity of the 1990s, and he really takes a kind of liberal turn. He takes a neo-Kantian turn in his philosophical sources. So he's no longer attempting to kind of rethink Hegelian Marxism, but he becomes a liberal Kantian who are a dime a dozen in the transatlantic space. He romanticizes the potential of constitutional and international law, again, in a huge wave on the left, without seeing that, of course, those things are as much leading the left astray and in this new kind of unipolar neoliberal world. And so
I have
he's
a
really,
quick question
yeah,
about
please.
that. Just, do you think that this and Habermas, I think, stands in for a larger turn as you gesture toward? Are they just mystified by U.S. power? I mean, the question, of course, that the contextualizing intellectual historian asks is why. Why
Yes.
does this neo-Kantianism become so? Why is he not indistinguishable but related to Fukuyama? Why does he embrace the end of history discourse in a genuine way? Um,
Yeah.
what about the con? Is it pure mystification?
I think it's not exactly American hegemony. He's not. I mean, he makes the mistake of engaging in apologetics for various American wars, most notably the Kosovo intervention, which I think we can never stop seeing as this pivotal turning point, especially for the left and Habermas as a then
And
leader of the
Russia.
left.
I think
And
that
well,
that shows
Russia, of course.
Putin that that they can't participate. I think
Of
that is
course. I mean,
correct.
I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
I think Russian elites generally are kind of convinced by the Kosovo affair to basically, treat the West promises as unreliable, and then of course they eternally cited Putin, not least in rationale of their own wars, including the Ukrainian intervention. But to go back to Habermas, I think his context is really West German. There's been a kind of new generation, a left generation that's criticized successfully the sins of the fathers. They've had the historical controversy around the Holocaust and made what Germany had done central to the West German outlook on what civilization requires. That's going to be fateful in various ways when it comes to Gaza. And if, but nonetheless, he sees that as a kind of huge step that he and his generation have taken. Um, it doesn't seem as if capitalism is in crisis. So that's no longer the focus. The focus is going to be, pluralism, getting along. And, there is the common kind of ground he has with the neo-Kantian liberals of the United States, like John Rawls, with whom he has a few, respectful debates, but, with they read one another's work, which would have been unthinkable even a decade before. And they're in the same kind of, if you will, communicative space. And so the old kind of discussions of continental Marxism are quickly forgotten, and most of the conversations are about, well, what kind of constitution will protect rights, and how should that work, and what should be the relation of international law to this constitutional process? Could we even dream of thinking of international law as itself constitutional? This launched really hundreds of careers, and though there were some dissidents who thought Habermas was taking critical theory in the wrong way, but let's say they lost. They were seen to lose, and so most of those in the West who were heirs of the Frankfurt School really followed Habermas in this more liberal direction. But in fact, they were apologists for U.S. militarism, and I think they just missed the significance of neoliberalism.
Just a couple more questions. How does he respond to the war on terror and the financial crash? Does he respond, or does he just continue the constitutionalism of his constitutional turn of the 90s?
The war on terror is, he is not down with the Iraq War, but as with so many others, a huge, set of people, the war on terror itself seems, um, just and necessary. There has been an attack. They don't see anything but a just war in attacking those who attack the United States and the West generally. He and others do draw the line at the Iraq War, like other West Europeans of that time. The financial crash, he doesn't have much to say about it. But remember, what is central really about the Frankfurt School from the first is that it's marginalizing a theory of capitalism and its crises. Now, in fairness, some of that first generation depends on who we look at. They're extremely interested in that problem. But the cultural turn in Marxism of the kind of Adorno, Benjamin, Horkheimer tendency is very fateful, because it makes it very difficult for post World War II heirs of this tradition to reactivate any kind of economism as
Well, they
part of
kick out
what.
Neumann and Kirchheimer. They literally said
That's
kick
right.
them out of the institute, and Pollock only stays because he's basically Horkheimer's assistant. So they kick out
Absolutely.
the sociological and economic thinkers in the 40s.
That's true. Now there is I'm not a big part of this either. It's nice of you to defer to me, but there's a ton of debate right now among those who study the early Frankfurt School about which theory we should kind of start with now, once we've concluded that cultural Marxism, if you will, um, has left us with too many blind spots. And I'm not in that debate, but it's very ferocious right now.
Yeah,
I
my
think for
sense is that
Habermas,
people are sort of recentering Neumann, is Franz Neumann is my sense, but I'm not also involved in this debate.
it depends on there's a bunch of people in this debate, and they each have a kind of hero. And so there's one, John Abermite, at in Albany, in Buffalo, who thinks
His
the
book
early
is from
Horkheimer.
his
Yeah,
book is great.
so
Yeah.
he's a fan of the early Horkheimer and so forth, and then there's state capitalist theory and many variations that, and I think it's probably true that the critical theory is not something just to junk because of what Habermas may have done or didn't do. It's a set of resources that we can ponder, and we build something else.
Absolutely. And so maybe just a final question, and don't worry, it'll be an easy one. Critical theory in Gaza, or Habermas in Gaza, or critical theory in Israel,
Yes.
and Habermas in Israel. I mean, this is, from my sense, I haven't looked into it in a bit, a little bit of an underexplored topic, but I'm wondering if you know anything or have any thoughts on that issue.
Well, so the general story I think we have to tell goes back, because critical theory TM just has no interest in the world at any point. And so it misses decolonization. Um, Edward Said is, when, 40 years ago, is writing about how critical theory is an extraordinarily Eurocentric enterprise, because its glory years are precisely at the height of anti-colonialism, about which it has nothing to say. And so its terrain of the Enlightenment, emancipation, reason is the West. And, if it's widened to the transatlantic space because of American hegemony, it's not a global enterprise. So then we get to um, is Israel Palestine, and I think the general story would have to be that the Frankfurt School ends up sharing the loyalty to Israel, really, of West German culture and policy, which ends up being an albatross later on, because it really disables folks who have drunk that Kool-Aid from seeing, what who the oppressor is now, and what it means to kind of take genocide seriously. And so famously, very at a very old age, advanced age, Habermas joins a letter, not in immediately after October 7th, but in mid to late November, basically calling for loyalty with Israel's war, within humane limits, um, and showing kind of really no sympathy for the kind of Palestinian oppression that is obviously, decades, if not longer, in the making, or how we might think in a balanced way about the stakes of what was going on, about the bombardment that had already commenced. So some of us did a letter in the Guardian in response to that. German letter that Habermas signed calling him out. And I think now it looks like we really do need to visit not so much his, because he's an old man. I don't think we should scapegoat a 95-year-old for something he said. It's not as if it's relevant to everything he may have achieved in his career.
We
But
should
I
make
think
him
we are
president of the United States.
right. Well, but I think we should revisit this West German memory culture. And there are a lot of really smart people who are doing that kind of analysis of how it could happen that West Germany thought it kind of had stood for a civilizational morality, but that very thing led them to, like, the stances, of, almost like absolute and unquestioned loyalty to Israeli policy after October 7th.
So just summative thoughts on Habermas, anything that we didn't get to. Great philosopher, made some mistakes. He was a man of
I,
contrasts.
I wouldn't. I think it's that he had a noble vocation, and social theory is something that a lot of people could benefit from trying to build and rebuild. And he took a shot. I think there's a great deal of value in studying what he attempted to do. I don't think we should reduce a kind of extraordinary enterprise of that kind to a few mistakes, but at the same time, I think he did make mistakes, and those were really in the way he accommodated critical theory to 1990s unipolarity and neoliberalism, and those very things led to the dreadful situation we're in, not just in Israel, but across the West and the world. And so that's a considerable flaw. And it means we need to restart the kind of project he stood up for.
Sam, thank you so much. Looking forward to having you back on the pod to talk about your new book on gerontocracy, which I'm sure cited my 2018 Guardian piece. I have no doubt it was an
No
inspiration
doubt.
to you. Well, thank you so much, Sam. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Good to talk to you, Danny.